Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be, and welcome to the DEI Leader Network's November event. My name is Holly Wittenberg, and I'm a managing partner at Diversity Works. We're here to talk today about another aspect of how diversity impacts innovation, growth, and responsible governance. Specifically, our esteemed panel will share their perspectives on the importance of diversity on boards. Diversity Works believes DEI efforts are the right thing to do because they foster fairness and equality, the smart thing to do as they drive innovation and financial performance, and the relevant thing to do as they reflect and serve the diverse world in which we operate. Diversity Works is a management consulting firm that works with a wide variety of organizations, and we established the DEI Leader Network in 2020 to support and nurture a resilient community of DEI practitioners who are increasingly encountering public backlash. The DLN hosts a series of complimentary monthly live events, maintains a private LinkedIn group for collaborative efforts, and provides peer support. We regularly share valuable resources and insights, and we want to make sure that this community feels supported. We love to talk about DEI, so never hesitate to reach out to have a conversation with us. We are always available for our DEI colleagues. So turning data into insights is really at the heart of what we do at Diversity Works. We created the DEI Plus diagnostic framework to evaluate performance. Our framework covers three distinct areas of DEI performance: strategy, internal, and external. Now, today's discussion will center on the strategy domain as boards set the purpose and shepherd the organization in the long term, and specifically focusing on vision and values, leadership and accountability, metrics, and KPIs, which we'll dive into further later. So we took a look at some research prepared by the 50/50 Women on Boards organization, which if you aren't following them, I highly recommend you do. And they analyzed the Russell 3000, which is a broad market index representing both large and small cap stocks. In short, white women and men hold the supermajority of Russell 3000 board seats. However, women overall do hold 29% of board seats, and underrepresented groups represent about 18.2%. Now, obviously, that's only a start, but it's a clear call to action for us not to just settle with the status quo, but to strive for boards that better mirror the diversity of our communities, which will enrich our companies with varied insights and create a stronger connection to our diverse customers and employees. So we took a look at the U.S. Census to make the comparison between the board composition numbers and the U.S. population. Let's take a look at the percentage of Hispanic individuals, which is about 19.1%. But people of Hispanic and Latino ethnicity only hold 3% of the board seats on the Russell 3000. Black Americans comprise about 13% of the U.S. population, but only hold about 8% of board seats. Again, diversity on the board is a proxy for bringing new ideas and approaches to the governance of your organization, and that's why it's important. The good news is women on boards has a very positive impact. This research from the Women's Leadership Foundation shows that when there are more than 3 women on boards, those stocks outperform significantly at 37% than those with no women on boards, which actually have a negative return. I'm moving quickly because the most important element of this webinar is the fantastic panel. So allow me to introduce you to them. Our first panelist, Beverly Cole, serves as a board member or advisor to public and private organizations. Her current board committees are Enterprise Risk and chair of the investment committee of a VC firm. She has a broad background as a former investment banker and corporate lawyer. She was selected to the Federal Reserve of the San Francisco EAC Committee and recently to the Small Business Administration Investment Capital Advisory Committee and the Global Women Think Tank. She served on boards of the National Park Foundation and Medical School. Our second panelist is Mary McDowell. I first met Mary when we worked for Compaq Computer Corporation, which was just a few years ago in Houston, Texas. Her careers included senior executive roles at personal computing and mobile device companies, and most recently, she was president and CEO of Polycom and then CEO of Mitel Networks. She currently serves as an independent director and compensation committee chair for Autodesk and as an independent director for Aero Electronics. And lastly, a senior independent director at Informa Group. Our third panelist, Kathryn McDonald, is a leader in sustainability investing. She is currently the co-founder and head of investments and sustainability at Radiant ESG, a female-owned independent asset management firm focused on next-generation ESG and impact investment opportunities for institutional and wealth management clients worldwide. She was previously the head of sustainable investing at Rosenberg Equities, overseeing the integration of ESG information in Rosenberg's investment process and leading the firm's ESG and impact research effort. Earlier in her career at Rosenberg, she held positions in portfolio management, applied research, and was the head of investments for Australia and New Zealand. She is also the founder of Aquinos Collective, a water research platform, a member of the board of the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia, a member of the Bretton Woods Committee, and a member of the Stewardship Council for the ACT Standard of Corporate Culture. So with that, let's dive into what is the role of the board. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary and ask her to sort of ground us in what a board does. And then that will inform our discussion about why diversity on a board can be such a powerful change.
Well, thanks, Holly, and thank you very much for not revealing just how many years ago it was that we worked at Combank together.
5 minutes. 5.
Yeah, let's go with that. So we've got a diverse audience, and so I thought I'd just start with some of the fundamentals. As probably most people know, a corporation is a legal construct providing limited liability to the shareholders. Shareholders make their money either through dividends or appreciation of the stock, but they are not personally and individually responsible for any debts that are accrued by the corporation. And the mechanism by which corporations are governed is the board of directors, which then become the representative of the shareholders. Legally, the independent directors are fiduciaries of the corporation, and so they are required by law to have a duty of loyalty and a duty of care to the corporation. And so that means basically that you're acting with your very best business judgment in the best interests of the corporation, and that you don't have any obvious conflicts of interest. And if there are any tangential, those have to be disclosed and agreed how they will be managed by the board. So essentially, people with the right business acumen and ability to represent the shareholders as the corporation fulfills its obligations to its shareholders. If you look again at the law, the board members are responsible for selecting, monitoring, evaluating, and compensating the CEO. That's probably one of the strongest levers, but it's a pretty dramatic lever that the board has. And of course, the board takes the role in succession planning, either as part of a planned retirement or other circumstances that might require a transition in the CEO suite. The board also reviews and approves the company's strategy as put forth by management, both the annual and long-range business plans, the overall strategy and ambitions of the company. And to do that, you really have to have the ability to engage in substantive business conversations. You have to have the ability to understand some of the key assumptions that are being made by management. And you have to have the wherewithal to be able to arrive at your own independent assessment of the risks associated with the management's plan and then guide accordingly. The board also has a role to ensure that the corporation is acting in compliance with ethical obligations, as well as complies with auditing and accounting principles, overall compliance with various local, federal regulations. And in addition, a board will also review material transactions, such as a large M&A deal. They have to have the ability to respond in times of crisis. Many boards were quite active during the pandemic, helping companies with different degrees of exposure respond to that. And then a board also has a responsibility to assess its own effectiveness in fulfilling its duties and legal obligations. So typically the competences of a director will be accounting and financial literacy, business judgment, strategic skills, leadership skills, understanding of management best practices. Typically, there will be knowledge of the industry sector that's required. And by and large, it's people that have C-suite experience. CEO and CFOs are the most common profiles, but certainly not the only profile of a typical independent director. P&L responsibility is often another avenue toward board service, typically P&L responsibility for a large division within a bigger corporation. Increasingly, there are other skills, but skills that have enterprise-wide impact, sustainability, human resources, things like that, that can often find their way into a board role. So this is a characterization of sort of the outlook for public boards. I know we've got some folks with background and experience or perhaps interest in PE or private boards. It's a similar type of construct, but instead of a pool of shareholders, you are essentially responsible to the lead shareholder or the owner of the corporation. And so in that way, understanding what shareholders want is not opaque. You can just pick up the phone and ask them. And if you don't ask, they will certainly tell you. Typically, there's a window of time to achieve some sort of strategic objective or transformation. Private boards and PE-backed boards tend to look less for general business athletes, but people who are bringing a specific skill or domain expertise to the board. Private boards tend to ask their directors to get more involved in, and this would apply to venture boards as well, more involved in some of the operations. So you'd want somebody with sort of deep experience in the sector, or, for example, deep experience in sort of the regulatory environment or something like that that can be used to actively involve the board. So I know we'll probably get into this as we get into some of the ways diversity impacts boards' ability to fulfill these legal and fiduciary responsibilities. But I think this context kind of grounds us, as Holly said.
That's great. Thank you. So now we're going to move into our first question. And we're going to ask Beverly to begin the discussion. And the question is, why is diversity good for the composition of boards for companies? Specifically, Beverly, what does the presence of a mix of perspectives and experience do to improve the effectiveness of a board?
Thank you, Holly. And thank you for inviting me to participate with this forum. I've enjoyed, of course, the participation and the connection. With that question, if I might piggyback on the idea of what board does and the descriptions of people who are, in fact, working on those boards, because diversity is much more complex than the ethnicity, the race, the culture, the gender. Those are the typical classifications we use, but everyone is unique and everyone brings a set of skill sets. And oftentimes, even looking at just C-suite people is not enough. I'm so glad Mary talked about the P&L or some enterprise-wide experience. And I would add those who've had a vendor, supplier and vendor expertise would also be very valuable. If you realize that in the boardroom, you are not an operator, you have oversight. And when you're looking at the diversity of the business, meaning what the business participates in, you're looking at the products, the services, the customers, the employees, the vendors, the contracts, the third-party contractors, all host of individuals. They're all people that you're working with. We like to quantify it some kind of way in enterprise risk, but it's really people. It all comes down to contracts and people and personalities. And all of that goes into how do you make this organization profitable? How do you make it perform effectively? You do it with a cost efficiency and savings, and grow, all for the purposes of the shareholder. And that's why diversity needs all of those inputs. I've seen where people will use alliances of the employees to help identify savings. Someone who's working a line can tell you, if we didn't do it this way, it would be better done another way. And you can take that into consideration. So if you have people who've had all of those experiences, that comes down to helping to make that business profitable and growing it for the stakeholders, jobs for the employees, and for the community on which it serves.
Fantastic. And so, Mary, we'd appreciate your perspective as well on this, and tell us what you think.
Right. Well, building on Beverly's remarks, the thing about business that makes it fun is the thing that makes it challenging is that it can be unpredictable. And so having a diversity of skill sets and mindsets allows you to react to the unexpected. If you think about the average CEO tenure is, 5 to 7 years, a CEO last year might not have ever seen inflation, might not have ever seen high interest rates. Aren't you glad you have some older people on your board that may have had experience with some of these more turbulent economic times to help understand the risk in the business plan and mitigation that should be put in to offset some of these risks? Could we have predicted that we'd all be talking about social justice in the wake of George Floyd? That was pretty rare and unexpected for a boardroom, but all of a sudden, rightfully and belatedly so, boards were starting to consider these issues, and having that diverse perspective allowed boards, not always, but to approach some of these issues more sensitively in response to the clamor from the workforce and their customer base. So I guess just the summary is, life comes at you fast, business life comes at you even faster. And so if you have these diverse experiences and these diverse perspectives, you are better equipped to be resilient, in fact, to thrive throughout some of these challenges.
That's great. And I'd like to, if you can share without breaching any confidentiality, we did see a important shift in understanding that the lived experiences of employees have an impact on their productivity at work, and that just curious what you saw on the boards that you've been on, how they responded to George Floyd in that context of how it was impacting their employees or other stakeholders.
As I said, these conversations, I've been on public boards since 2010. I had never seen these sorts of conversations happening at the board level. What are we doing, both in terms of supporting employees, some of whom were going through trauma, and then actively, let's take a harder look at our own numbers and our own practices in terms of pay, promotion, recruiting, so that the diversity objectives are not just something that we look at once a year and then check back later to see how we did, but kind of actively monitored, and change in practices when you discover things aren't effective. So I think it was a fantastic wake-up call for companies.
Great, and thank you. I might double back to you and Beverly in a second, but I want to give Kathryn a chance to share her thoughts as well. From an investor's perspective, what do you look for when you're selecting companies, and specifically from a board perspective?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Holly, and thanks everyone for joining today. When we think about this idea of what makes diverse boards more effective, I'd like to go back to something that Mary introduced, which is really that we see the board as kind of the keeper of long horizon strategy for the company. And the essential objective for any company really is, how do we either remain or how do we become relevant in a changing world? And, in very practical terms, this often takes the form of trying to keep existing customers, building new markets for our products and services, making strategic decisions about risk or operational efficiency. And there's this interaction between the board and management that's really meant to be a kind of a rudder for the firm, especially in choppy waters. So when it comes to the guidance and this very necessary, kind of check on the executive function that the board is supposed to provide, especially in the face of a lot of unknowns, we see the biggest challenge to boards as being the problem of groupthink. And by that, I mean falling into this echo chamber of, we all agree with each other. Everybody kind of has the same background. Everybody really thinks a lot alike. We reinforce each other, and we're very much myopic to other problems and challenges that are out there because we are just so deeply similar. And when we think about, again, what stands in the way between a good company being great or even a middling company being good, we think of groupthink as this big destroyer of value. And that's true throughout an organization, but it's especially true in the roles where we expect to have strategic thinking. So our interest in diverse boards is really predicated on the notion that diversity, both the presence of diversity and practice diversity, and I'm sure we'll come on to that in just a second, is really this remedy to groupthink. And I'll echo Beverly's comment about diversity goes well beyond women and race. There are a bunch of different things that we can say about diversity. Age has already been brought up, but even problem solving, even what is your your first language, all of that brings diverse views to a company. So as investors, we look at these relationships between diversity and more effective outcomes in terms of what companies can achieve. And Holly, you already put up the slide that shows stronger EPS growth. Research that I've been involved in personally has shown that companies with better board diversity are better able to hang on to a profitability advantage, that diversity kind of serves as a profitability moat. There are other studies out there that talk about greater gender diversity leading to lower or different uses of leverage, maybe more conservative accounting. That kind of plays into the often observed statistic that companies with greater board diversity have better credit ratings. Companies with better board diversity have fewer ethical and corruption problems. So we see that there are a lot of these great economic effects that we believe are the product of companies really actively meditating on and doing something about this problem of groupthink. So I'll be very clear, as investors, we're not advocating diversity because we think it's fair, because we think it's nice, because we want to give people a shot. We're advocating it as investors because we see very hardline and substantive economic reasons to favor companies with better board diversity.
Thank you for that. And, for any one of you, I'd like to ask you a couple follow-up questions on this point. So how do you see the topic of diversity on boards differ between European or international companies versus the US? Maybe I'll start with Kathryn, since you were just talking and you led the Australia, New Zealand group for Rosenberg. What did you see in Asia, for example?
Well, I'll start with Europe, perhaps, because Europe is in Europe, we have the longest, at least within public companies, the longest examples of diversity being a requirement, or if it's not a requirement, it's either a kind of a comply or explain, sort of format that they work with. And it has been very effective, as you might imagine, in getting the number of women, and it's gender focused, the number of women on boards to be higher. In other parts of the world, in the United States, for example, in California, where I'm based, there was the requirement briefly that companies of a certain size have at least one woman on the board. Now, that was challenged in the courts, and we're kind of in this back and forth as to whether or not this is legal or not legal in the state of California. But what we observed was that upon the initiation of that law, everybody thought, well, it's going to be impossible to find where are all these women going to come from. Well, lo and behold, it was actually not difficult for companies to find very qualified women to be on their boards. There wasn't this, overboarding problem that everybody predicted. Women came from different parts of organizations, perhaps, than they might traditionally have, but they were all deemed to be extremely qualified, and it was very effective. So I think that there's no doubt that a sort of a top-down, regulator-driven requirement is actually much more effective at boosting the number of women on boards. But as you showed, in one of your beginning slides, the number of women on boards, even in the US, where there is no uniform requirement, has been increasing over time. Perhaps not to the extent that satisfies some of us, but it has been increasing.
Holly,
you're on mute.
Any differences, Beverly, that you've seen between U.S. and international boards?
Absolutely. I was a consultant in one case to some international companies, and also served in another capacity with a U.S. company that was becoming aware of this. And it was, there's a tendency with the U.S. company to want to go wherever they go and make it like them. Our CEO and our people tend to, this is our way and it's the best way. Where I have seen people in Canada and in other parts of the world, instead they try to adapt to the culture where they are going if there is a subsidiary located there. Case in point, I was working with a company that had facilities in Asia and in part of the Arab area. And I've been to some of these places, by the way, in my travels. So I'm very well aware of the differences in how people do things. And it was very interesting that in one particular case, as an example, we had a vendor who this was in India, where women were doing many of the products that we were doing, and the children were in a vicinity very close to the mothers. And that came under attack as, of course, a legal activity, when they didn't realize that that is the culture of that area. And over time, you've started to see in the US, I know with one of the companies I've worked with, where they've actually put the children in a center close to where the parents work, so parents can go and visit the children during lunchtime. So people have changed over the course of employment in the United States to adapt to women who are working and who have families.
Right.
Okay, example, just to share.
Wonderful, thank you. And Mary, you've been on boards both of a number of international firms. Can you speak to what you've seen? I know especially you had introduced us to a UK firm, and the UK is definitely a different environment in this respect. Is that correct? You're on mute.
Sorry. Kathryn spoke to the quotas, and, while there was the initial concern about the golden skirts, because they thought there would maybe be only 3 women that qualified, that was definitely not the case. But the other big regulatory difference is the fact that there's a limited window of time where you are perceived as being independent by the stock exchanges. So in the UK, it's 9 years. And so it amounts to essentially term limits. And so there's a forced board refreshment on European boards that you don't have in the US. And so that just opens up the door more quickly to bring in the diverse perspectives. Right. That you really don't see in the US.
Thank you. All right, well, Beverly, we're going to move on to the next question. And that's really, once a woman or someone with a different background or different lived experience joins a board, what can the board do to help them find their voice and have the necessary impact? Because just sitting there isn't enough. We need engagement and we need purpose.
Well, what I've seen some really best practices where you've had actually the board members to participate in a training and sharing of information with new board members. I saw some wonderful examples of that most recently. And in other cases, I've seen where people will adopt the woman or the new board member and try to respond and open the door for discussions. Now, there are personalities in the boardroom where the newbie board person is just an inquisitive soul and will reach out to everyone and ask questions, and that's good. But sometimes that's not the case. I think the key is that we as women, and I've also learned from men that they also feel this, that imposter syndrome. We sometimes feel that if we ask that question, is it something that will embarrass us or make us seem not bright or whatever? And I've come to the conclusion, I'll just ask the question. I mean, I would rather just go ahead and you'll be surprised. Somebody else is probably thinking about that too.
I always think it's the confident, smart people that ask questions, but I might be biased because I like to ask a lot of questions. Mary, what do you think boards can do to be more inclusive?
I think from the perspective of the woman on the board to really understand your role, and I thought Beverly said it really well, you are there in an advisory capacity, you are not management, but you need to have the attitude of, how can I be helpful in supporting the corporation in achieving its goals? And then, of course, you're in the room as the goals are being approved. So if you think that there are risks, you need to bring that up at the time. But how do you support that? And then there are typically opportunities outside the boardroom, attending sales conferences, attending customer events, depending on the nature of the company, going to visit one of their major factories or warehouses, or experiencing their product or experience in some sort of way, that will all help you have a more informed perspective and allow you to meet the community within the company. My UK board, for example, has a number of affinity groups around race, ethnicity. They have one in the US for veterans, a variety of those. And they've asked the independent directors to act as sponsors for the affinity groups. Which I hadn't seen before. And it's great because it allows that perspective to come into the boardroom in a way that otherwise would not have been possible. So I think, the right attitude, the orientation toward knowing your role, and then looking for opportunities beyond the boardroom.
That's great. And, at the end of the day, your responsibility is to the shareholders, right? The investors. And so you have to be brave. You have to, take the steps, but hopefully a strong leader, a strong chairman will do the right thing to create an inclusive culture. Kathryn, please share your perspective.
Yeah, I think it's you've hit the nail on the head with this idea of inclusive culture, because how we get inclusion is probably a little bit different depending on sort of where we are in the company, or if we're at the board level. We worry a little bit less about board members not speaking up at the board level, because we are thinking that typically they come from other roles where they have had to be opinionated and they do have subject matter knowledge. But certainly the board as a collection, whether it's through training or some boards just have it more innately in their culture, develop a mindset of everybody needs to be questioning, everybody needs to be contributing, dissent, productive dissent, but dissent is welcome. And how can we, within the walls of this board meeting, have a very open, honest, flowing discussion where everybody, gets to put their 2 cents in and everybody gets to question everybody else? That's difficult to achieve, but some boards do it really, really well.
In a previous discussion you and I had about groupthink, one of the definitions of groupthink is that you don't use data to make your decisions, right? You use sort of this consensus of experience likely. Can you talk a little bit about how the use of data can and that challenging of that data can help make better decisions?
Yeah, I think it's often very effective when and everybody can bring their own data set. And frankly, if you interrogate the data enough, you can get it to kind of say whatever you want it to say. But it's often very effective when you have somebody who is sort of nominally assigned to bring sort of, here's the research or here's the data, and then everybody can kind of sit around and talk about it objectively. That tends to work really well, because it does force people, it is a little bit confronting when there are long held beliefs that maybe were true 5 or 10 years ago, but maybe are not true now, and so going back to Mary's example of, oh, we're in a high inflation regime. Well, a lot of the stuff that we were talking about 5 years ago, we really have to give ourselves a mental check, because that may or may not still hold today. And so having someone or a group of individuals who are tasked with, here's a critical empirical analysis of whatever the thing is, really, I think forces people to, ask themselves some hard questions and ask some questions of each other.
Great. We've got about 5 minutes left before Q&A, so we're going to tackle our next topic, which is relevant to a question we've gotten in the chat, which is about suggestions on how to start networking and how to get exposure to board rules. So for the person who asked that question, I think this third question should cover that, but if it doesn't, feel free to ask a follow-on question. So Beverly, what advice would you give to a woman or really anybody interested in being on a board who's maybe either early on in their career and has a 15, 20-year out goal to be on a public board? What decisions they should be making now, or even somebody who now is ready and feels they have the appropriate experience? What advice would you give them later in their career?
Well, I would say to them to network, build relationships along the way, seize the opportunity to take on positions, and do not be afraid. We oftentimes feel that we have to get educated. We haven't done something, so therefore can we do it? That kind of reluctance to take on a role. I can tell you, my number 1 and 2 regret is when I was asked to be a CFO of a Fortune 500 company, and I said no, because this guy who wanted it so badly, and I thought, well, he was older than I, maybe he should have it. Come on, be selfish, take that role. They saw it in you, and be there. And then with relationships, they wanted to tap me to run the money of estate funds, pension funds, and you don't use the relationships you have to help you, because someone may say you can only do it on your own. You have to prove you're number one, or you can do this. Step out of your comfort zone. That is the key. And do things so that you can be seen and be recognized along the way.
I think that's great. I mean, I think public speaking opportunities, anytime someone gives you an opportunity to be in front of an audience, I would certainly suggest that. Publications. But I'm going to turn it over to Mary for her to give her good counsel to this group.
It's funny, Beverly, networking was at the top of my list as well. You'll discover that you have to have an infinite capacity for coffee when you're starting to think about networking for board service. It's a numbers game because there is no forced board retirement in the US. The number of board seats that become available every year is very small relative to the number of people that are interested. And while a lot of the opportunities go through the traditional headhunting routes, not all of them. So your network and being active, and I know all of us tend to get heads down in the work and you don't keep up with people, but an email, a chat. Someone said to me the other week, if you haven't talked or had an exchange with somebody in the past year, you can't really count them as being in your network. So, keep up, how you doing? It's just another thing on your work to-do list, and it will pay dividends later. And then just be persistent. you really can't predict where opportunities are going to come from. I'm active in my alumni group, and it was there that I found a connection to a PE firm where I got my first CEO job. Did I know when I was, heading down to Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, that I was going to make a connection that was going to lead to the CEO job that I really, really wanted? I did not. I thought I was, there to talk engineering and, losing Illini football. But so you just never know where these things are going to come from. And so be opportunistic, be persistent, and be patient.
And I think, to state the obvious, tell people you want to be on a board. So don't just network, but network and communicate what your ambitions are. Great. Thank you, Mary. And Kathryn?
Yeah, finally, just two quick pieces of advice. I think, Holly, at the end of this presentation or somewhere in the presentation, you have a list of organizations that are really committed to promoting female leadership, and then, leadership amongst people who are underrepresented generally on boards. Several of these have training programs. So you can listen to a training on, here's a training on corporate governance, or here's a training on, ethics and bribery overseas. I mean, they all have these kind of narrow things, but you can get training on that. The other thing that I would suggest, lots of not-for-profits, especially smaller not-for-profits, have boards. They need board members. And I promise you that the people who are on this call today have something that they could offer a not-for-profit. And being on a smaller board gives you an opportunity to really get your arms around that dynamism from the difference between running the business versus kind of overseeing and guiding the business. That's a very important tension that boards have to be aware of and that board members have to play.
Thank you. And so, as Kathryn mentioned, we've got a list of resources which we'll also include in our recap and our follow-up from this webinar. So don't feel pressed to screenshot or scribble down these names. We will send them to you. If you do not get them for any reason, they'll be on our website probably in the next 5 days or so. So I would like to open it up to the Q&A. We do have one question right now, which is open to any of you, but is there a magic number that board should try and reach to break the groupthink? Let's put it that way instead of to achieve diversity. Yes, Mary.
So I don't know that there's a magic number, but sort of the adage that people talk about with women on boards, that if there's one, it's a queen bee. If there's two, it's rival queen bees. And if there's three, it's just a group of people. And the issue of gender kind of disappears into the woodwork. So I think you want enough differentiation among your directors so that your differences can come to bear in a value added way, and you're kind of united by your common purpose in supporting the corporation.
And we have a question about board pay and what people should expect as a board member for compensation. And does it differ based on years of experience on the board? Is it like any job where you negotiate, or is it usually in the charter? Beverly, you want to take that one?
Sure. Actually, there's some resources I can tell people to go to. The Private Directors Association and the National Association of Corporate Directors have all posted comparisons of various types of companies, from private companies, family-owned companies, to actual public companies. And you'll be shocked at the variety and the span of fee and composition. In some cases, it's a fee base. In some cases, it's a committee attendance based. In some, it's a grant. Sometimes they provide shares of stock outright. Sometimes they want you to allow them to stay on and have a vested interest in the company. Therefore, you can't exercise those shares. And in fact, as I'm of the mindset, as long as you're with the company, you should be representative of the company and participate just like a shareholder anyway, because you all are in it for the same reason. But there are sources out there that you can go to, and I encourage people to do that.
Great. And generally, curious about any particular stories you might have of where you've seen board diversity drive a better decision at the organization, or any other anecdote that you'd like to share with the group before we wrap up.
I think, I'll tout a little bit of our own research, but certainly what we found was that companies with better board diversity, again, we think via this mechanism of a reduction in groupthink. When we saw the downturn in corporate earnings at the global financial crisis, so this was a few years ago at this point, companies with better diversity were able to better hold on to revenues. Now, that doesn't mean that their revenues didn't drop. It just didn't drop as much as those of their competitors. And we have to be very careful too. We've got to make sure that we've neutralized for, the size effect. So big versus small companies, we've got to make sure that we've neutralized for an industry effect. But having done all of that statistical assurances, we still saw, and we think that it's because there's a better ability from diverse leadership to hang on to existing customers or to bring their product to a market that heretofore wasn't a big customer of theirs. And so there is, again, back to this idea that there are a lot of economic reasons we're interested in diversity. Yes, we can observe all of these things independently. We could easily have gone out and said, okay, let's find the companies that didn't lose sales as quickly as others. We can observe that. But when we think about investing, what we're really interested in is, where is this company heading? So diversity on the board gives us some belief that the company is positioning itself for a future that might look very different than the past. And so we like diversity as a way of, quote, future-proofing the company a little bit.
Holly, may I also add to that, because it's not only being the diversity of the board, but the diversity of all of the members within the company.
Yeah.
And I think one of the key examples you can give is at one time food ketchup was the number one condiment. And now everything's got a spice, and a hot spice. From hot potato chips, hot popcorn, hot beer, hot everything. And that's a part of another culture's influence.
Yeah.
And that has grown revenue and profitability for a lot of companies.
I'll let Mary, do you want to close out with any final comments, and then we'll thank everybody for attending?
Yeah, I think the thing that people are really struggling with is, how do you measure diversity and how do you hold boards and management accountable for it? And, I think people, particularly people on the call who are part of the ESG community, there's a little bit of a backlash now in some circles. And so how do you drive the right incentives and mindset and culture that will drive a diverse workforce and respect for that in your culture? And how do you align that from an incentive standpoint? I think is still being worked out, because what people don't want is it becoming a substitute for business performance. And I think we just haven't figured that out. And I think some of the backlash is a perception that, you're going to back solve if you missed your number, you're going to back solve and goose your diversity goals and use that to offset the drop in your bonus. And so, like I said, I think this is very much an issue that's under hot debate. And so, hopefully we can get to a resolution that we do have the right incentives and mindset to support the very necessary work in diversity and align that with the business performance goals.
Well, I'd like to thank all three of you, our fantastic panel, and for your time and your preparation and your participation today. I think, the research bears out that diverse organizations, whether they're teams, boards, companies, are more resilient, more innovative, and more productive. And I think we've heard all of those things come from you. And why should boards be any different as a team? As we mentioned, we will be sending out a link to the recording and a summary, along with some toolkits and some resources. And as I mentioned before, we love talking about DEI. My email is here and I'm on LinkedIn. If you would like to QR, you can join our LinkedIn group, which is a private LinkedIn group. Again, as part of this DEI Leader Network, we're trying to create communities where people can talk about these issues constructively and with a business focus. So with that, I will thank everybody who participated, and again to the panelists for the generosity of sharing your expertise and time to help us all be a little bit smarter on this topic. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care.